My name is Adele Jacobs, and I'm the first Vice President of Voices of Hope and the daughter of Fred and Regina Jacobs, two Holocaust survivors of Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen concentration camps. I want to welcome you to the fourth program in Voices of Hope virtual summer series. Voices of Hope is an organization founded by descendants of Holocaust survivors with a mission of promoting a culture of courage to stand up against hatred, Holocaust and genocide education and remembrance. I hope that you enjoyed last week's program on Yiddish culture in wartime Europe with Trinity College professor Sam Cassow in partnership with the Jewish Hartford European Roots Project. In case you missed it, please feel free to go to the Voices of Hope website or Facebook page to find a recording of the presentation. I am so pleased to be welcoming my rabbi, Rabbi Marcelo Kormis of Congregation Bethel in Fairfield. Rabbi Kormis works hard to inspire people of all ages to engage in Jewish tradition, to be moved to work for social justice, to establish close ties with Israel, and experience prayer and life cycle events in a vibrant and meaningful way. Prior to joining Congregation Bethel in Fairfield in 2012, he served as associate rabbi of the 900 family Circulo Israelita congregation in Santiago, Chile. Rabbi Kormis hosts a podcast series with a priest and an imam called An Imam, a Priest, and a Rabbi Walk into a Bar. His videos and classes on social media are followed by hundreds of viewers weekly. Before I formally welcome Rabbi Kormis, I am going to ask that you please mute yourselves, and should you have any questions, please use the chat feature. We're going to have time for some Q&A at the end of this presentation. And now let's give a warm welcome to Rabbi Marcelo Kormis.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much, Adele, for your introduction. And thank you, Voices of Hope, for inviting me to be with you this evening. I'm really honored to be with you. I have been following some of the summer series. It has been really a wonderful program, and I'm glad to have the opportunity to talk to you tonight about one of the most challenging topics, I believe, connected to the Shoah. I think that the faith after the Holocaust is certainly one of the most difficult questions that we modern Jews are facing right now. And it has to do with our nature as Jewish people, and it has to do with our beliefs, and it has to do with the question, how can we still believe in God after the horrors of the Holocaust, after the horrors of the Shoah? So tonight I would like to do three things with you. The first one is I would like to have a short introduction to the topic. Then I would like to share with you a summary of one of my, or one of the most meaningful articles that I have read about this topic. And then we would like to open the floor for questions and answers. And I would love to make this interactive, so feel free to, after we conclude the second part, to write some questions or some comments and how you feel about it. I'm sure that many of you have given a lot of thought, I hope, to this question, which again is one of the hardest questions that we have today as modern Jews living after the Holocaust. So I would like to begin this presentation by sharing with you a movie. I'm not going to play the movie now, but I just want to point out to a movie that is called God on Trial. Let me just see, showing of hands, how many people have watched this movie, God on Trial? Not many, okay. So this is a movie that is deeply connected to the topic that we will be discussing today. So the play takes place in Auschwitz during Second World War, and Jewish prisoners there put God on trial for abandoning the Jewish. The question that they put forth during this trial is whether God has broken God's covenant with the Jewish people by allowing the Germans to commit genocide. Right? So that's a very powerful question. We don't know if this is a true story, but I can think, you know, and I can picture some of the survivors and people who went through concentration camps and people who went through labor camps asking this question and asking and having a conversation, where is God, right? Or how can we really believe in God under these circumstances? And for us, the question is even more puzzling, and is, how can we even continue believing in God after the Shoah? Okay, so if you have not watched this movie, I highly recommend it to you. I think it's available in the social media platforms. It's called God on Trial. So the question that I'm going to try to answer tonight, and again, I'm not sure I have a definite answer, and I'm not sure that anyone could have a definite answer about how can we keep our faith after the Holocaust, or how can we explain the role, the action, or the inaction of God during the Holocaust. And that's one of the most challenging questions in our generation. And that belongs to, in philosophy, we call that the theodicy, meaning God's justice, and how can we connect or relate to the justice of God in our world, and particularly during the Shoah. So I would like to start the conversation with two quotes that I think would bring the conversation in the right perspective. The first one is from Hasidic masters who used to say the following words. I'm going to say them in Hebrew first. They used to say, Ilu yedativ ha'itiv, meaning, if I would know God, I would be God. If I would know God, I would be God. And the Hasidic masters used to say this in order to make a difference between our human understanding and the divine action in the world. And we have to be humble enough to understand that we may not have all the answers to all the questions that we have in our world. And that requires from us, first, to be humble. Second, it requires from us a great deal of thought, trying to find answers. And the third element that I think is related to this idea of not knowing God's ways or not comprehending God's ways is that we have to build our own personal theology. And when I talk about this issue of the Holocaust, particularly faith connected to the Holocaust, I always tell my students, my congregants, and in this case, you and the viewers today, that we should be always working, trying to build our own personal theology. And what I mean by personal theology is the way we understand the world, not only in connection to God and the Holocaust, but questions such as good and evil, questions such as creation versus evolution, reward and punishment. There are many topics that belong to this realm of creating or building our own personal theology, that it starts when we are little, and we should be building upon it as we grow. Okay? So I think that this idea is very powerful of Lu yedativ ha'itiv. And it places, us human beings in the right place when we think about the action or inaction of God in the world, and we'll talk about that later today. And then the other idea that I would like to share with you is a quote from the prophet Isaiah, and I have it right here from the Bible, and he says the following. It's chapter 55 in the book of Isaiah, and he follows this, and this quote follows really this same idea, placing us far from really understanding God's actions in the world. So the prophet says, chapter 55, verse 8, he says, Ki lo machshevotai machshevoteichem, velo darkeichem derachai neum Hashem. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, nor my ways are your ways, says the Lord, right? So we have to face this issue of faith and the Holocaust and faith during and after the Holocaust, I believe, from a very humble perspective, knowing that we may not have all the answers, knowing that we may leave tonight with more questions than answers, but I think it's worth for us to embark, ourselves in this adventure, trying to give answer to the question that we will be sharing tonight. So What I would like to do with you tonight is to share with you one of my favorite articles about this topic. You know, a number of books were written about faith after and during the Holocaust, but one of the texts that I like the most was written by Rabbi Pinchas Peli. I don't know how many of you have heard the name. Rabbi Peli was a famous rabbi in Israel. He belonged to the modern Orthodox movement. Was, you know, he had a relationship with the conservative movement in Israel. And he wrote an article that I have it here, and I'll be happy to share it with anyone who's interested in reading it in depth. I have only 45 minutes to share with you an article that could take us, you know, hours in order to analyze it in depth, but I'll be happy to email it to you, or maybe I can email it to one of the hosts today, and then you can disseminate it if someone would like to read this article. So the name of the article is In Search of Religious Language for the Holocaust. In Search of Religious Language for the Holocaust. And what Rabbi Peli does is something very interesting. He says, you know what? There are a number of ways how we can try to understand faith during and after the Holocaust. But he says, I'm going to do it based on stories from the Bible. He says, when I read the Bible, I find there different models, and he finds there 7 models, okay? 7 models that can help me to create a religious language, how to understand what happened during the Holocaust, okay? So I want to share with you briefly these 7 models. And again, I don't think we will all have a definitive answer or a right or wrong approach or a right or wrong answer. What I would like to try to do with you today is to give you some tools, give you some elements for you to enrich your personal theology, for you to continue building your personal approach based on your values, based on your understanding of the world, trying to answer this question of faith after the Holocaust. Okay, so I'm going to share with you 7 different models. They are not exclusive, meaning that if you feel comfortable with one, and then another one, and then another one, maybe you can incorporate them all to your personal theology. Or if you say, you know what, I cannot really relate to this one. This is not talking to me, right? I cannot relate to this. That's fine too. That's fine too, okay? So let me begin with the first model that Rabbi Peli presents. And he says that when we read the story of the first Adam, when we read the story of the first human being on earth, we can, based on that model, we can try to understand what happened in the Holocaust. And he calls this first model the model of sin and punishment. The model of sin and punishment, meaning human beings sinned and therefore they were punished. And when you read the story in Genesis chapter 3, and you read about Adam and Eve disobeying God's order of not eating from the fruit of the tree of knowledge, then they were punished, right? So this first model says that there are consequences to our actions. And he says the same can be applied to what happened during the Holocaust. He says, and he asks, you know, himself, what is the sin? What could be so a great sin that could be punished with the death or the murder of 6 million Jews? And he says, you know what? Let's try to explore what are possible sins related to this. He says, the first one could be the sin of Zionism or opposition to Zionism. You know, there is this idea that the state of Israel should be created or should be established by God, not by human, right? And therefore, the acceleration of the Zionist movement and the creation of the state of Israel only 3 years after the conclusion of the war, he says, could be a potential sin in the eyes of God. Or he says, people who oppose to the Zionism and people who said, you know what, we shouldn't be or we shouldn't be supporting the Zionist movement, and therefore the punishment of the Shoah. That's a potential answer. I don't really like it. I don't think that there is a big scene that could really explain how 6 million people were murdered. Another scene that he brings in his article is assimilation. And this is something that has been discussed at length. And some people argue, some rabbis would argue, that because of the assimilation that was happening in Germany, and you know that German Jews were highly assimilated, they were punished with the Shoah. And by their personal choices, their personal decisions, they brought this horrible episode to happen to them and to their community. Okay? And again, I don't think that this is a possible model. Some people would feel comfortable with it, and this is the first model that Rabbi Peli presents. The second model is what he calls the model of Cain and Hevel. And when you go to the next chapter, chapter 4 in the book of Genesis, we have the first murder that happened in the history of mankind. And we have Cain killing his brother Abel. And he says that out of his free will, Cain decided to kill his brother. So the question is not where was God there or where was God in the Shoah. The question is where were people in the Shoah and how did we use or exercise this gift of free will? And he says, you know what? People are not robots. People have free will. And therefore, we are constantly exercising. We are constantly exercising our free will. We're constantly choosing between doing good and bad, or bad and wrong, and good and evil. And he said, Germans and the Nazis decided to exercise their free will, and they decided to murder millions of people. Therefore, the question should not be, where was God during the Shoah? The question should be, where were the humans? Where was our ability to choose between good and evil, between right and wrong? So the question that I have for that model is, why didn't God stop it? And that's probably the question that many of you have after listening to this second model. So my answer is that God probably, after creating human beings, after creating the world, and since God endowed us with free will, God is deciding not to intervene, not to interfere with our free will. Because if God would intervene, if God will stop and change our decisions, we would stop having this ability of free will. And therefore, we would be only robots, and we wouldn't be humans with this capacity of choosing between right and wrong. Okay, so this is the second model, the model that he calls the free will that is connected to the first murder of Cain killing his brother Abel. The third model, and then at the end, I'm going to summarize everything. If you're not taking notes and you're trying to memorize, I know that would be a little complicated, but I just want to bring here to the table some ideas that you can adopt in order to build your own personal theology or your response, your answer to the question that we are trying to address tonight. So the third model, he calls it the binding of Isaac. And when you go to Genesis chapter 22, you see there that Abraham takes his son Isaac and he offers him on the altar, or was about to offer his son on the altar as a sacrifice to God. So many people have seen Isaac as the representation, or have seen, Jews in concentration camps as following the same model. Because what did Isaac say to Abraham when he was being not carried, but being walked with Abraham, his father, to Mount Moriah? He didn't say anything. The Bible at least doesn't say or doesn't tell us anything that Isaac was questioning or Isaac was challenging his father and asking him, Dad, what are we doing? The only thing that Isaac asked is, God, where's the fire and where is the machelet? Where's the knife, right? Those are the only questions that he asks, and that's it. So some theologians, some rabbis have seen that Jews, some Jews didn't fight back, didn't question, they just accepted their fate. And that could be a possible model to explain why the Shoah happened and how people could continue believing, because that's destiny. And, Jews were destined to endure this challenge in order to strengthen their faith for the future. We had the opportunity 3 years ago to go with Adele and a group from my Congregation Bethel. We participated in the March of the Living, and we visited concentration camps. And some people say, well, why didn't the Jews revolted? Why didn't the Jews fought back? Why didn't they say anything? They went, katzol latevach, they were like lambs, and sheep to their place of death. Well, when you visit the concentration camp, you see how hard it was to even think about revolting, how hard it was to even plan saying something, or take any action against the Nazis. And that's why Mordechai Anilevich and those who revolted at the Warsaw Ghetto, I think they are heroes, right? Because under those horrible circumstances, they found the strength to revolt against the Nazis. So this third model presents the Jews in a light of acceptance, right? We accept what happened and we move forward, as Abraham and Isaac did. The fourth model is the model of Eov. And I'm sure that many of you have read the book of Eov. And if not, I highly recommend it to you. It's one of the books in the Bible. And it speaks about Eov, who endures all kinds of challenges and tests in his life. First, he loses everything, his family and his wealth. And then his body is stricken by leprosy. And then he has friends who come to try to give him some solace. And finally, it's a test that he was put to, according to this book, to see if he would maintain his faith in God. And the end of the book is that, yes, he keeps his faith in God, and he was rewarded for that. So this fourth model presents the Shoah and the Holocaust and the faith in God as a test, right? We were tested as Jewish people, as we have been tested in other times in our history, times like Tisha B'Av, the destruction of the first and the second temple, the expulsion of Jews from Portugal, England, and Spain. Or in modern times, we were challenged right after the creation of the State of Israel with the War of Independence. And we stood and we fought back and we won, if you want, that challenge. But Jewish people have been challenged all over our history, okay? So this is a challenge. The Shoah, in the light of this model of Eov, is presented as a challenge to see if we would keep or not our faith in God. And again, you could say, wow, this is a big test, right? Wasn't there, a lighter test that God could put in front of us, lighter than the Shoah and killing, and murdering 6 million of our brothers and sisters? Well, maybe. But this is, another way how to maybe understand or possibly understand the faith and the connection between faith and the Holocaust. Then the fifth model is the model of silence. And this is a very interesting model because it's taken from Leviticus chapter 10. You probably remember that Aaron, the high priest, he had 4 sons, 2 of them died. And when Moses told Aaron, his brother, that two of his children died, what was Aaron's response? The Torah says, Va'idom Aharon. And Aaron was silent. No words, no response. There are no words that can express the suffering. There are no possible words that can express our feelings when we are confronted with challenging and difficult times in our lives. And probably this is a model that many of us identify with it, because it's very hard, at least I'm gonna speak for me, and then I'll be happy to hear what you have to say, but it's very hard for me, even now that I'm talking about this, to find the right words, how to describe the horrors of the Shoah other than silence, right? And for many people, for many survivors, this was their reaction after the Holocaust. Silence. They wouldn't tell anyone about what they endured during the Shoah. They wouldn't share with their children or grandchildren their personal stories. And even in my family, my grandparents, and I've shared this story a number of times, my grandparents were living in Berlin for many generations. My grandparents in 1939, they felt that something, was gonna happen. They escaped from Germany to Holland. From there, they took a ship or a boat to Chile, to Santiago. I was born there. My father was born there, and I was born there. And they were lucky that they decided to leave Germany. But some of my relatives of that generation never shared with us their stories, never talked about it. Because silence is a possible way how to find faith after the Holocaust. So how can we keep our faith? For some people would be to remain silent, because sometimes you cannot find the words to express the horrors and to express your feelings. Okay, so this is based on the story of Aaron and the tragic loss of his 2 sons. And then the last 2 models are radical, but I think are worth for us to explore them tonight. The 6th model is what Rabbi Peli called the eclipse of God. And this is based on interpretation of Martin Buber, a modern philosopher from last century who lived in Germany. And there is a couple of verses in the book of Deuteronomy chapter 31, where it says there that there's going to come a time when God is going to eclipse God's face. It's not that God is disappearing, God is only hiding himself or herself. So God is hiding, and therefore God is eclipsing God's presence in the world. And we call it in Hebrew Hastarat Panim. And this is a model that was adopted by other philosophers who have identified through the course of our history, Jewish history, particular moments when God has hidden his face, and we have not been able to feel the presence or the guidance of God in the world. And they point out and they say that probably the Holocaust was one of these moments when we couldn't feel the presence of God or the direction of God in the world. And they talk about this eclipse of God. And there is one even more radical model, which is the last model that I'm going to discuss with you tonight. And it's called the death of God. One of the proponents of this model is one of our congregants here at Congregation Bethel. We are very lucky and fortunate to have Dr. Richard Rubinstein. He wrote a book that is called After Auschwitz. And there he says, or he follows this idea of Nietzsche, really, which is more of a Christian theology about the death of God. But interestingly, there were some Jewish philosophers who adopted this theory of the death of God, and they applied it to the Holocaust. And what they said is that after the Holocaust, God died. This is completely in contrast with the idea of a living God, right? That we talk about it, that we talk about God this way from a Jewish perspective, Elohim Chaim, right? A living God that is a constant source of inspiration to the world. Well, following this idea of the death of God, they would argue that after the Holocaust, this was so horrible, so terrible, that it's hard to continue believing in God, and therefore we should say, and we should hold the idea that God died. Now, I've had extensive conversations with Professor Rubinstein about this topic, and he was very revolutionary at the beginning. I think that he softened his views a little bit now in his early life, in the past few years, and I think that what I understand from this theory of the death of God is not that God died, but is that the idea of God died for human beings, for people. And there is a difference between saying that God is dead and saying that the idea or the notion of God or the conception of God died for us human beings, okay? And this is not a talk about that particular idea. I'll be happy to expand that in any other occasion that you feel comfortable doing that. But I think there's a crucial difference there. So the death of God is not that God is dead, it's that for us humans, it's very hard to connect to a God that allowed the Shoah to happen, okay? So let me summarize these 7 ideas, these 7 models. And again, my goal tonight is to share with you some of these ideas. So some of them you may have said, well, this doesn't make sense to me. I cannot relate to this one. Some other models you could say, well, yes, maybe. Okay, so try to incorporate, some ideas. Try to continue building your personal theology and trying to address this question, how can we keep our faith after the Holocaust? How can we keep our faith alive after the horrible episodes that we, the Jewish people, endured during World War II? Okay, so let me summarize this, and then I'll turn it back to Adele, and we will open the floor for Q&A, and I'll be very curious to know how do you feel about these models, and what questions or comments do you have about them, and if there is any model that makes sense to you or not. Okay, so the first model is this idea of sin and punishment, right? So the Jewish people sinned and therefore God punished us based on the idea of the first Adam who disobeyed the first Adam and Eve, right? Who disobeyed God's commandments. The second model is the model of the free will, based on this idea of Cain killing his brother Abel, based on his free will. And therefore, the question would be not where was God during the Shoah, or how can we keep our faith in God, but our question would be, where were we, human beings, and how can we keep our faith in us, human beings, for the future? That we are not going to repeat what happened back then, again, in the life or in the course of history. The third model is the binding of Isaac, presenting the Jewish people as accepting, our fate, accepting our destiny, and like Isaac, being guided by his father, going to Mount Moriah. The fourth model is the model of Eov, presenting the Shoah as a test, big challenge, a big test to prove or not our faith in God, and how some, people could come out from the Shoah and their faith could come out strengthened after experiencing the horrors of the Shoah. The fifth model is the model of silence, based on this story of Aaron losing his 2 children or 2 of his 4 children, and responding with silence, not being able to find any words that could really express his feelings and the horror that he was going through. And then the last two models that are in a way related to each other, this eclipse of God, that there were times in history where God hid his or her presence in the world, and we couldn't feel the presence of God back then, and the Shoah was one of those moments. But then after the Shoah and today, we could feel that presence, maybe, and we can relate to God after the Shoah. And then the more radical model of the death of God, saying that it is very hard for us modern Jews to continue believing in God, particularly after what happened in the Shoah. Okay, so I'm going to stop here because we want to open the floor for comments, for Q&A, and I'll be happy to engage with you in discussion. So I'll turn it back to you, Adele.
Okay, thank you so much, Rabbi. Please ask your questions again in the chat feature. Deirdre Dolan, it looks like, said that many in the camps used their Judaism to survive. So I'm not sure whether that's just a basic comment or not, but it seems to kind of address maybe the silence model, because people weren't silent necessarily in the camps about their faith in God.
Yeah, and
sometimes unbelievably.
When you visit the concentration camps, you see a number of ritual objects that were used there. And we know that for many Jews, the way to keep their faith in God was to continue their Jewish life under, very, very challenging and horrible circumstances. We know about Jews who would refrain from, for example, eating a little piece of bread during Passover. And they knew it was Passover, and that was the only thing that they had to eat, but they wouldn't eat that piece of bread because it was Passover. We know about Jews who would, secretly light candles for Hanukkah or Fridays. They would light candles and they would try to celebrate Shabbat. Jews who would fast on Yom Kippur. Right? So we know that faith was certainly something that sustained many Jews through the Holocaust. So the question is, did they continue doing it after it? I know that we have a number of second generation members here. It would be interesting for us to hear how I don't know if we have any survivor who's with us today, but it would be very interesting for us to see if your parents continued observing Jewish tradition after the horrors that they endured during the Holocaust.
Well, while we're waiting for some more questions, my parents also didn't eat bread on Pesach. They refused that little portion of bread that they got, but they also always had a struggle with their belief in God. I think they were angry at God, but they always kept all the traditions. So I'd be interested to hear other people's experiences as well.
Yeah.
Leah and Ann Schmer, I can't read the rest of the name, I'm so sorry, said that my mother, a survivor of Auschwitz, used to say that she was broigus with God, even if he existed, if he even existed. Somebody else wanted to know from you, Rabbi, how the rabbis explain the Spanish Inquisition and this expulsion.
Well, that's our topic today, but I just want to say that some of the models that I was sharing with you today were also applied to other challenging times in Jewish history, right? So it's not only the expulsion of Jews from Spain, but it's also the expulsion of Jews from Portugal and England. It's also the destruction of the Second Temple, of the First Temple, right? and many other challenging times that we have experienced in the course of our history. I see one question here. Which one do you prefer? I think of this, I would choose the silence model. I have a combination. I really feel, I really can relate to the second model and to the model of silence. I really believe that the question is not only where was God. I think that the powerful question here is, where were human beings during the time of the Shoah? And we saw that so many people decided to do evil. So many people decided to harm other human beings. But at the same time, we saw so many people who acted with love and care and generosity, risking their own lives, putting their own lives at risk in order to save Jews. So clearly, the free will, to me, is intrinsically related to this idea of God and to this episode of mankind, right? So people had the opportunity to choose between doing evil or doing good, between saving Jews or harming Jews. And then at the same time, the model of silence is a model that I relate to it, because even now that I'm talking to you, it's very hard for me to find the right words, how to express what happened through the Holocaust. So I feel, you know, these two models talk to me.
So there's another question, Rabbi, from Ellen Umansky from Fairfield University. What about the model of protest, that protesting God's justice, rooted in Abraham's arguing with God in Genesis 18 over God's wanting to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, Jacob wrestling with the angel, and the story of Job, seen not from the vantage point of God as a test, but from Job's view questioning God's justice. And she says that this is the model on which Elie Wiesel, Yitz Greenberg, David Blumenthal, and others have drawn.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, that's another possible model, the model of protest. And I identify some of the Hasidei Umot HaOlam, some of the righteous Gentiles who were part of this model. And again, they put their lives at risk in order to protest, in order to speak up, in order to save, you know, the Jews. Actually, when we went to Poland, I don't know if you remember, Adele, when we were there, we met some of these righteous Gentiles, and one of them who was awarded by Yad Vashem, and they shared their story with us. It was a very powerful story, how they put their lives at risk in order to save Jews. So I think that this model of protest, this model of speaking up, is certainly another model that could speak to many people trying to find an answer to the question, where was God during the Holocaust? And even more, this is not a conversation about God itself, but I feel so when I teach or when I talk about God, one of the questions that people normally ask me is, God, Rabbi, how can you believe in God, right? How can we in a modern world, in our modern society, believe in God? And I always challenge them, and I tell them, the problem with that is that we live in a very physical, materialistic society, right? So this is a computer because I can touch it, you know. This is my phone because I can touch it and I can see it. You know, this is, I don't know, this is my watch because I can touch it and I can see it. But where is God? Can you see God? Can you touch God? No, you can't. And therefore, many people say, well, that's a proof that God doesn't exist. So my answer to that is that we can see the presence of God. And we see the presence of God through people. We can feel, we can see the presence of God through the interaction between human beings. So when you help someone who's in need, when you have a sensitive heart, and when you help those who are suffering, what you're doing is you are bringing the presence of God to the world. And I don't have time to expand on this, but I just want to mention that this is based on, and I It's not my original idea. It's an idea that Franz Rosenzweig brings in his book, Kochav HaGeulah, The Star of Redemption. And he says there that when you read chapter 18 in the book of Genesis, you see that when Abraham was recovering from his Brit Milah, when Abraham was recovering from his circumcision, the Torah says there, Vayera elav Hashem. So God showed up or appeared to Abraham. And then the next verse says that Abraham lifted up his eyes and he saw 3 people. So the question is, who visited Abraham? It was God or were 3 people? And what Rosenzweig says that I think is a very powerful idea is that God manifests God's self through us, through people. So I think that when we think about faith after the show, and going back to the question to what model I feel more relevant for my life, certainly the model of the free will is, to me, is one of the models that makes more sense, because people, by choosing to do good, what they are doing is they are bringing the presence of God to the world. So this righteous Gentile who put his or her life at risk to save a Jew was personifying the presence of God in the world.
So, Rabbi, when you say that, you know, there were many more bad people than good people during the Shoah. So how do you kind of comport that theory that you're espousing with the fact that there were so many bad, evil people, so many willing executioners, and still believe in God with the few good people that were there?
Well, I think that the question is a very, very hard question to answer, right? Because again, people decided to exercise their free will. And I think that the answer or the question is really, why didn't God stop them? Why didn't God stop them? And again, I think that since God decided to endow us with free will, God is also deciding not to intervene. Why didn't God intervene? Well, Lu yedativ ha'itiv, right? If I would know why, we would be God. And therefore, we should be humble enough to say and to understand that we may not have all the answers.
So Stu Abrams, who sits on our board at Voices of Hope, has a question that from those who survived the Shoah, how many who entered the concentration camp universe as practicing Jews came out still believing in God, and how many didn't? Are there statistics about that, Rabbi?
I don't know. I don't know. Maybe someone who's participating in the call knows the statistics. I don't know them, but I do know that the process played both ways. I know, and I've met survivors who were religious or observant. Let's use the word observant. Survivors who were observant before the Shoah, and after the Shoah, they stopped observing the commandments, the mitzvot, because they said something, similar to what we are discussing today. How could God allow this to happen? I'm, stopping here. I'm not following the mitzvot anymore. And then at the same time, as one of, the participants mentioned today, the other way around happened as well. People who were not observant, but they, kept their Judaism. They tried to keep their Judaism alive. And when the Shoah was over, they would continue practicing their Judaism, even deeper than what they would do it before the Shoah started. So I don't know the statistics themselves, but I do know that the Shoah was a transformative process for their faith. For some people, and listen, there is no recipe for this, right? So we all respond differently to the challenges that we face in life. So for some people, after experiencing the Shoah, they wouldn't continue observing the commandments. And for others, the opposite. They would strengthen their participation.
if there are any 2Gs on the call, I'd be interested to hear, I think we all would be interested to hear about your parents' experiences, whether they kept the traditions, didn't follow the traditions, or where in the spectrum they ended up after the Shoah. If anybody's willing to share. I can tell you that while we're waiting for people, that my parents kept a lot of traditions out of respect for their parents. They worked on Saturday because they owned a business, but they didn't smoke. Friday night, when my mother lit the candles, they stopped smoking until 3 Stars came out on Saturday night. But they kept all the holidays. And when my mother prayed over the Shabbos candles or the Yontif candles, you could see she was really having a conversation with God. She prayed, she wept, she had a serious conversation, but she didn't go to shul very much.
And how do you feel, Adele, about this? Because being a second generation, how do you understand this idea of faith after the Holocaust, interacting with your parents and seeing them struggling probably with this question? How do you see this in the perspective of a second generation person?
I was brought up not religious, very traditional, but not religious, but very Zionistic, very Israel oriented. And my friends growing up all the way through to my adulthood used to say, "Oh, Adele, she's so Jewish." So I had the Tom, I guess, but the form, but not so much of the substance. But now I have grown into my own spiritual place with God. So, I like going to shul, and I enjoy the interaction with God. So Paul Goldstein writes that his parents kept their traditions, but believed that the people who perished should have fought back, but didn't because they believed God would save them.
Interesting. Yeah. So that's connected to one of the models that I was presenting to you today, which is the binding of Isaac, right? So we see Isaac not protesting. We see Isaac not questioning his father, just, waiting for a miracle to happen, waiting for God to probably help him. And yes, a number of survivors felt the same way. They felt that other Jews should have fought back, and they didn't do it because they were waiting for a miracle to happen. And in a certain way, they were just accepting their destiny. They were accepting their fate.
So Renee Rishke writes that she's a 2G, and her father was a hidden child who lost his whole family at Auschwitz. He came to America and married a Christian woman. She was raised in the church, and her father finally told her that he was Jewish when she was 16. He was frightened that Nazis would come get us if anyone knew about our Jewish heritage. After my father died, I married a Jewish man and converted to Judaism.
Nice story. Thank you for sharing with us.
And Leon Gould wrote, Rabbi, can you expound between the external God and an internal God, i.e. the inspired revelation which can guide human beings?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'll be happy to expand this idea for the remaining 3 minutes before we close. So you're giving me 3 minutes.
Adele, can I say something about I just wanted to say, Marge, I just wanted to say about my mom, who was very religious, Orthodox, continued to be religious throughout the whole time, and still is very religious. And my father, who went in he wasn't religious, and he came out really angry with God, and just said that there was, that.
You have both in your family, right?
Yeah. Yes, both in my family.
So have you ever asked them why, what happened to them in their faith?
Well, my dad lost his entire family. He had nobody. He was really just no one. And my mom she survived with her family. And I think that I don't think she would have called it, the way of protest, but basically living each day, I think, was her way in her family. She was with her mother and her sister, and just living each day and surviving, I think, was a way of kind of her protest, just getting by, getting through the death marches and getting through all of these things and having her family together. And my grandmother would always say, we were so lucky because we had our whole family came out together. And so
you think that losing relatives was a major element
for my father, for sure. Yeah.
Well,
Yes.
Rabbi, thank you so much. I think we have to cut it off here. Unfortunately, this is a topic that could go on for quite a while, and it's a fascinating topic. Had we been able to have our annual conference.
Let me just address what Leon Gold is saying. We have 3 minutes, so let me just take
go ahead.
advantage of the 3 minutes that I have. So I just want to say that there is a difference between the way that I see external God and internal God. One has to do with what we call in Hebrew hashgacha, meaning how God runs the world and what God is planning for us as a collective group of people, in this case, the Jewish people. So that would be the external God, and the internal God is the way we personally connect to God, right? And I think that both come together, the external God and the internal God, in the view of Maimonides. And again, I'm summarizing, a lecture of 1 hour and 45 minutes into 2 minutes. But when I was a child, I don't know if you had it here in the United States, we had these books that they were called, in Spanish, they were called Choose Your Own Adventure, so you read the page and then you came to the bottom of the page and said, if you want to go into the cave, go to page 18. If you want to fight back the monster, go to page 22. And then you went to page 22 and then you had all the options at the end. So the author of the book knew or knows all the options that you have for you. And that's God, right? But you didn't know what's going to happen to you or what will be your options until you get to the bottom of the page. And that's each one of us choosing according to our view and our understanding of our internal connection or relationship to God. But this external God, this God who's out there watching us and guiding us, is the author of the entire movies, the author of the entire book, that knows what are all the possibilities that we can choose, but he just cannot tell us what to choose because we choose that based on our free will. Okay, I'm going to stop there.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. This has been incredibly inspiring, and we really appreciate your participation and everybody else's. So thank you all for coming tonight. We look forward to our next program on Tuesday, July 14th with film producer Mike Turner as he discusses what it is taken to produce his film, The Monument, a new documentary about Holocaust memory, memorialization, and inherited trauma. We hope you'll join us then. When you have a moment, I encourage you to check out Voices of Hope's website and Facebook page to see all that our organization has to offer. In addition to the programs such as these that we provide to the community, we work every day on our primary mission, which is to support education about the Holocaust and genocide. And if you like today's program, donations are greatly appreciated, especially during these times, and can be made on the Voices of Hope website, ctvoicesofhope.org. Your support is greatly appreciated. Thank you so much for joining us. Everybody stay safe and stay well.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.